Welcome to the nonprofits. Well, it turns out that Texans aren't the only ones stirring up trouble this week. In our third segment, we look at how federal agents are sharing in the atrocities. Attorneys from the National Immigrant Justice Center and the ACLU of Illinois have accused federal immigration authorities of unlawful arrests and constitutional violations in at least 22 cases since the current administration's immigration crackdown began. The motion filed in Chicago alleges that ICE agents arrested individuals without probable cause, created warrants after detaining people, and violated the NAVA settlement, a 2018 agreement meant to prevent warrantless arrests. Cases include a U.S. citizen wrongly detained and workers arrested without warrants. Lawyers argue these actions breach federal law and the Fourth Amendment. ICE declined to comment. This story is from the Chicago Sun-Times by Adriana, Cardona, Maguigad on March 14th, 2025. So we'll start off by going to Jimmy here. Jimmy, can you give us some specifics on some of the individuals that have been affected by these improper arrests?
Well, sure. We now at this point have heard, everybody should have heard, if you're paying attention, that American citizens are just being rounded up. People with permission to be in this country are being rounded up and being targeted to have their protected status, if they're not yet citizens, removed if they're political prisoners. For example, the 400,000 Venezuelans that are being considered, or a move that is now being blocked by one judge, but being considered to have their protected status removed. Abel Orozco Ortega, detained outside his home in suburban Lyons in Chicago without a warrant. He was buying tamales. Well, that guy must be a criminal, right?
Of course.
I love tamales.
Yeah. And then we've got, I am going to butcher this, even though I've heard it before. Rumesa Ozturk, the 30-year-old Boston area graduate student who was arrested and detained, who really did nothing wrong. She wrote an op-ed about the Palestinian conflict and in a pro-Palestinian form. And of course, she was detained by masked men who were unidentified. And then in Liberty, Missouri, 12 restaurant workers barricaded inside a Mexican restaurant. Well, they're restaurant workers in a Mexican restaurant. They must be illegal and they must be criminals, right? But they were closed in by the Department of Homeland Security, who arrested them without a warrant. And so, I think this is just the beginning. We're at risk, and I am going to use some really harsh language, but I like to think in terms of extremes, because if we don't, then we let those extremes happen, and it's because we didn't take it seriously enough. But, we could be facing a major genocide here, right here in the United States against light-skinned brown people. And if those of us with a voice don't stand up and recognize this wrongdoing, we certainly could be enablers. And so that's what I have to say on that.
Definitely. I saw the video of the Rumesa Ozturk getting abducted. It was very disturbing, and it was, I'm sure it was an extremely traumatic experience. Even if they end up letting her go or whatever, it was just that experience alone can cause long-term trauma, and it's very, very disturbing.
I failed to mention, when we were writing the script for this show, I didn't add the story that came out yesterday about the El Salvadorian man who was an American. He was here legally. I don't believe he was an American citizen yet. Oh, no, he was an American citizen, but he was deported to El Salvador and put in one of the worst prisons that you could be in. Right. And he was here on political asylum initially because he was in danger in El Salvador. I mean, and I hear that there's no attempt in trying to get him back, which is a shame.
Right. Is he the one that already had a judge's order specifically forbidding that he be deported?
Yes. So I think I'm wrong on the citizen part, but nonetheless came here for protected status.
Right. You're fleeing a dangerous situation, and you hear these stories about America, a land of the free and home of the brave, and then you get here and then you're kicked out, even though you were here, even though you did go through all the proper channels and everything. it's frustrating. Helen, could you expand on that idea a little bit? Are these arrests they're illegal, right? This is an illegal thing happening. If so, how so?
Because you're, even if you're here like on a green card, or you're here as a student, or you're here under protected status, you are under law that you can be here in the country legally. You can't be deported. You can't be arrested for just having legal status to be in the country. You know, you're not, and that's the thing that's so messed up about this. Like this is a side example, but my mom is still here on her visa. Like, she is an immigrant from Quebec. Technically she's white, so I don't know how this is going to play out, and she's old, but she could be.
That's sad. Yeah. But I agree. Yeah.
But she could technically be deported. You know, if we're going to take this literally, she could be deported. But unfortunately, this law is racist as fuck, and I'm sorry, but it is. And they're focusing on the brown people, because what happens under fascist governments? You know what happens under fascist governments? You blame minorities that don't have any power. And you villainize them, you start deporting them. And then when that doesn't, cut the mustard, you remove it. Then we move on to more extreme things that Jimmy alluded to. Now, I don't want that to happen, obviously, but this type of crap that's happening, this would happen in other parts of the world, in the early to mid 20th century, where things got really bad, guys, really bad. So we really got to stop, do protests, and you should be doing your best to help your neighbor. Again, if you're a person of privilege, use your privilege to help somebody else. Right. And it's going to suck. It's not going to be comfortable. It's going to suck.
It's kind of like one of those situations where you just can't believe that it's happening. I mean, I kind of feel like I'm struck. Like, it's just like, really? Is this real? This, because you imagine this kind of thing happening, especially when politicians get talking about each other and that kind of thing, and they, bring up this kind of stuff. But here we are. I mean, it's really hard to argue that there's not horrible things happening right now. And it's to the point where people that don't recognize what this, you almost think that it must be intentional. It must be, willful ignorance. Right. Jimmy, I want to go back to you a little bit here. Helen was talking about the arrests and the policy mandating these arrests. And then I just want you to get your opinion on this. Do you think this is part of that larger agenda? Do you think there's ulterior motives here? Do you think this is specifically a racially motivated thing? Or do you think it's just a safety issue gone wrong and, improperly and incompetently enacted?
It's got to be a racial issue, because white people are not being rounded up or deported. White people are not being threatened. They might be in other capacities, but not because they're white. American citizens, people with protected status, all those people that are being threatened are of Latino heritage, period. And so I can't see this not being a racial issue. In fact, the judge that blocked the move to remove protected status from I said 400,000 Venezuelans earlier, it's actually 600, said that this move was being done through a racial justification. And he sees that this is not right. And the rest of us need to see that this is not right. I think that these are racist justifications. And it's to the point that I'm now looking at our own law enforcement like I look at the Gestapo in 1930s Germany. I mean, ICE is now a tool for fascist-minded people. They're
the brown coats now. They're the brown coats. Yeah. Right.
And so verification of citizenship is not even required. They're just rounding them up. And, there was an immense amount of pressure on these law enforcement agencies, particularly the people doing the tactical acquisition of these so-called criminals, as there is pressure on people all across the government. It's why we saw this ridiculous email from our supposed King Musk saying you'd better justify what you've been doing last week. People are going, oh shit, I think I'm doing a good job. Why am I being harassed? And so we're seeing ICE agents and federal law enforcement to avoid being targeted and laid off and remove themselves, acquiescing to this larger effort, which is wrong. It's flat out wrong.
Mm-hmm.
It's wrong not only for the victims of the crimes, but it's wrong to put people in a position where they have to do that, where their livelihood is at threat, and maybe even worse for them, for their situation, if they're labeled as, a dissenter or a troublemaker or something like that. They're not just going to lose their job. They're going to lose their communities. They're going to lose their, in many cases, their family. And it's really tough to put somebody in a situation where you have to do something that you believe is immoral, or keep your family fed. It's really it's hard to see an upside to this. I mean, obviously there's not, but clearly somebody is at least imagining an upside here. Speaking of that, Helen, I want to go back to you for a second here. According to studies cited by NPR, research indicates that immigrants commit less crimes than U.S.-born people. Economist Ran Abraminski of Stanford University found that since 1960s, immigrants are 60% less likely to be incarcerated than U.S.-born people. He talks about incarcerations because that's the stage of the process where they look into citizenship status. So immigrants are 60% likely to be incarcerated. There's also a state level research that shows similar results. Researchers at the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank, looked into Texas in 2019. So we're back in Texas now. They found that undocumented immigrants were 37.1% less likely to be convicted of a crime. Beyond incarceration rates, research also shows that there's no correlation between undocumented people and a rise in crime, rate of crime. Okay, I'm going to say that again. There is no correlation between undocumented people and a rise in the crime rate. Recent investigations by the New York Times and the Marshall Project found that between 2007 and 2016, there was no link between undocumented immigrants and the rise in violent or property crime. So, as we found in earlier segments this week, we have a solution that doesn't seem to address any kind of problem. I hate to keep going back to the racism trough, but if it looks like a bigotry and quacks like a bigotry, it's probably bigotry, right? Is it really that simple? Is this just flat out racism, or could there? Let's try to at least put ourselves in the other perspective. Could there conceivably be some sort of legal or policy objective here, or is it just straight up racism?
Yeah, it's racism. Because if they were being honest and they were really looking at, looking at this from, is there a correlation between illegal immigration and violence? Problems with the economy, because everybody was complaining about how, immigrants are going to take my job and, and all this type of stuff. No, stop it. It's racism. It's racism because the only people they're paying attention to happen to be people from Latina countries.
Right. Yeah.
So
yeah, exactly. 600,000 Venezuelans,
that's
right?
The reality of it.
That's a pretty big sample size right there.
Yeah, and so if that is your goal, is to blame people that have more melanin than you do and happen to come from a different country where they speak a different language than you, and you don't understand their culture because you don't bother to learn anything, and the thing is though. When people are disgusted by what they don't understand and they're disgusted by differences. And if you don't have your critical thinking brain on and being like, this was some, psychological priming and bullshit that was fed to me about people that, are different than me, what you do is you jump to fear. I don't understand this. So you jump to fear, you jump to disgust. And what do we want to do with things that disgust us? We want to push it away, don't want anything to do with it. And then you have the right to dehumanize another human being and not recognize that this is going to traumatize them. You are fucking up their lives. I'm sorry, I'm swearing a lot. This pisses me off. Like this whole
You've done
thing.
a great job of restraint up to this point so far. I would have been, I think there's much more swearing that's deserved here.
Yeah, we should all be pissed off.
Yes.
There is a backlash effect to this too. And let's just sit here and think about this, people. Okay, like let's just say that you are a Hispanic family living in the United States, okay? And your father and mother, you're allowed to stay here with one parent, but your other parent gets deported back to El Salvador, Guatemala, pick a Latina country.
Right.
What does that do to that family?
Yeah, exactly.
And how are they going to feel about the country that they immigrated to looking for a better life to protect their family, and a family member gets deported back?
Right. The man that was sent to the El Salvador prison, the reason why we know for sure that he's in that prison is because his wife saw footage of that prison on TV covering the story of people being deported to El Salvador and saw him at the prison.
That's disgusting.
Yeah.
That right there
was able to confirm
right there.
She didn't know where he was, suspected that he had been deported, but had no idea until she saw on TV that her husband was indeed in El Salvador in a prison where he's in danger.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that you would think that they would at least give her that much, at least just tell her where her husband is.
No, but no,
it's just gone and disappeared, just by happenstance was able to find that information. That's amazing. That's amazing.
He's not considered a person. He's considered a problem, and that's the thing. Because when humans, she doesn't deserve respect. She doesn't deserve to know where her husband is. Because that's what racism does. This is what fascism does. Right. It tells you that certain other people are not people. They're a less than. And that's why we're seeing, this is why I'm just so mad because it's so terrible what is happening. And again, like Scott, you were saying before, like this is not America. This is un-American. This is not the America that I had the idea of when, especially coming from a family of immigrants. Both of my parents, my mom is from Canada and my dad's dad is from Albania. Mm-hmm. So, and so when you have that perspective and, of that melting pot and, different people, coming together, it's just heartbreaking that this is happening.
I want to stick on the racism idea. I know it's difficult to talk about, so I really appreciate both of you having this conversation. I think this is I think it's good for people to be able to talk about this kind of thing in a relatively safe environment like we are here, and especially because there's so many people that don't have that kind of environment where they can have this kind of discussion. So thank you both for that. But Jimmy, I wanted to ask you, we've talked many times on the nonprofits on how conservative thought, both politically and religiously, is very often tied to, and there's tons of studies that show this, is correlated to an authoritarian perspective, an authoritarian mindset. And we also know that those who have such an authoritarian mindset are very vulnerable to fear response. Okay, they react very strongly to threats and to fear-based situations. Do you think that, obviously there's horrible racism happening, whether it was intended to be racism or whether it's even worse, racism of indifference. Do you think that this could be, there could be some kind of political benefit for taking advantage of this kind of racism? And again, I want to stress, I think almost that kind of racism is worse, the racism of indifference. They're just playing along with the racism to get the votes kind of thing. Do you think that there's an aspect of that in the story here?
Well, sure. I think the hate is being intentionally engineered. I think that it is being created to freeze the status quo or, well, first of all, to change it, but now to maintain it, right? I think that border security and economic problems, even though the economy was good and improving, were the major issues that people voted the way that they did. And because they were under the impression that immigrants were the problem for a failing economy. But you know what? When you are not educated on how immigrants make an economy work and how an economy works, and that it's actually in a good spot, better than when the president at the time took office, then you have a tendency to go along with the engineered hate. And I think that that's what's happening. I forget who said it. Boy, we love the uneducated. Doesn't matter who said it. But, you know, it just goes to show you that, you know, having an uneducated mass or base, I should say, and keeping them that way by dismantling education outlets, dismantling the Department of Education and funding to schools, goes along with allowing this blame to be propagated, if you will. And so, yeah, I think that while there might not be people that are themselves racist, they're going along with the racism because it helps their position, their wallet, and their power. And so that's the unfortunate part about it. You know, a lot of people have decided that racism is not a red line for them, and that's scary.
Yeah, that kind of like that callous indifference is really just not, that's not part of a world I want to be in. And speaking of worlds that I'm not in, I want to tie in the religion again. We haven't really talked a lot about the religion in this. These stories are just so horrific that it's like half an hour before we can even get to the religion part. But I want to read a few quotes from a book that I'm sure you're all familiar with here. First quote, "You shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." That's from Deuteronomy 10:19. "The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." That's from Leviticus 19:34. "Thus says the Lord of hosts, render true judgments, show kindness and mercy to one another, do not oppress the widow, the orphan, the alien, or the poor, and do not devise evil in your hearts against one another." That's from Zechariah 7:9-10. Last one here. "Let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers. For doing that, some have entertained, and for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. Remember those who are in prison, as those who were in prison with them, those who are being tortured, as though you are being tortured yourself." And so, in other words, welcome them as your brothers, welcome them as among yourselves. And that's from Hebrews 13:1-3. So, the Bible, obviously that was all from, is especially relevant here because there's a huge overlap in those who are supporting these immigration policies and those who support the Freudian slip there, the Christian nationalist movement. And I'm going to ask this from both of you. Do these people actually read their own book? And why do you think pointing out the unchristian nature of these policies does nothing to stem the tide of hate? We'll go to Jimmy first, and then we'll finish with Helen. Do you think they read their own book, and why is this not having an effect?
No, at large, most Christians don't read their own books. Human beings are generally lazy. And if they have somebody standing at the front of their congregation holding the book, telling them, "Hey, I read it for you. You know, this is what it says," they're probably comfortable doing that. I'm sorry, say the second part of your question again. Do they read their own books?
Why does pointing out these things not change anything? If we point to, I just listed, it was so easy to find those 5 or 6 verses. I could have kept going. Why does that not change anything?
Because I think that people don't really care. Honestly, they are not willing to trade the position that they're in. Heck, as far as I know, Jesus said to give all your things away to the poor, right? I don't think that we're going to see anybody do that. Any Bible thumping Christian do that. In fact, they're more likely to hoard wealth just like most other people are willing to hoard things that they identify essential to their own survival. I don't think that people who claim to be Christian at large really care. I just think they care about their own well-being like most regular people do. And they use this Christian dogma instead as a way to say, or to describe us versus them. So that way they can demonize the them.
Right. Yeah. Helen, do you have anything to add to that? I know you and I have had a great discussion about lazy thinking. Do you think lazy thinking is contributing to this, or do you think, what do you think is going on? I know that you were a former Catholic there. What are your thoughts?
So my kind of feeling is that they're not reading their book, or if they are, they're picking and choosing what they want to pull out of it, like every other religion does. So they read, if they read the words, they're like, I don't like that, be kind to your neighbor thing, but I like this thing about like, being the righteous, that I like, that I'm going to take that away, so, or be there, as Jimmy said, they just need someone to tell them what to do and how to think. And they're not, as they're not using their critical thinking skills. It's easier just to go with the flow, do lazy thinking, and not do the hard work of going, well, they're telling me this, like these people are bad, but I haven't seen any evidence that these people are bad.
Right.
I haven't seen anything that's affecting my life. I still have my job. I'm still pretty comfortable. Like,
right.
Am I being fed some bullshit? You don't see it, because even if they question it for 2 seconds, then another thing that what people don't like is that they'll psychologically protect themselves against things that they don't like about themselves. Yep, and having to deal with your internal biases is going to make people feel uncomfortable. And instead of doing that, which is look at your bias and examine it for what it fucking is, I'm just going to blame. I'm going to say those people are the bad people, and I am justified in thinking the way that I do.
I agree.
Because that's what a bigot going to do. What a bigot going to do.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And we could keep going on for many, many hours here, but I think we need to stop here. So I want to thank everybody for listening. And if you'd like to listen more, then you can just click right here.